Make sure to subscribe for your daily dose of fear, and don't forget to hit the like button and leave a comment about your favorite part of today's story. Want even more exclusive scares? Join our membership for members-only live streams and stories you won't find anywhere else. Your next nightmare awaits. Let's get into it. There was a nun who was on her way to midnight mass one night. She was driving down a lonely country road. It was very dark outside, and she was worried as it was getting late. She kissed the rosary beads around her neck and said a prayer. She glanced at her car radio's clock and saw that it was exactly 12 p.m. When she looked back at the road, she saw a tall, dark figure standing there with his thumb sticking out, and her heart swelled. She thought she saw it before. She was about to drive past, but she thought she could use some company, so she pulled over to the side of the road. The man walked over to her car and opened the door. He was very tall and thin, and his face was pale white. He wore a huge overcoat and a big black hat. "Do you want a ride?" she asked. He looked down upon her and smiled. "Why, sure. Where are you going?" "I'm heading to church for midnight mass," she said. "You going that way?" "Thereabouts," he said as Her got into the back seat of the car. "Thanks for stopping. Usually, no one stops for hitchhikers this late at night." The nun smiled and drove on down the road. On the way, she told the man all about her life and her faith. He listened and laughed once in a while. As the church came into view, he leaned forward and asked her to stop. "Are you sure?" said the nun. "I could take you a little farther." As he got out, he replied, "No, I'll be good right here. I'll walk. Actually, I have someone coming for me. Right near this spot." "Are you sure?" she asked, as she had seemed to like his company. "No, but thank you, Clarice, for the ride." He smiled at her and then walked down the road. Then she wondered, "I never told him my name." She got out of her car and looked down at the tracks he left and screamed. Where his footprints were, there was hoof prints. She drove into Busby, arrived at the church, and told the priest about what had happened. She showed him her car, and in the back seat, there was a devil sign. The next morning, she was found dead in her car, right where she had dropped the hitchhiker off. There is a well-known Japanese scary story that involves a creepy clown. There were 3 boys who loved watching horror movies. One day, one of the boys received a parcel in the mail. There were no stamps on the mysterious package, and no name or address was written on the front. The boy had no idea who it was from. When he opened the parcel, he found a DVD inside. There was no cover on the case and no title on the disc. He thought his friends might be playing a joke on him, so he took the DVD and went out to meet the other boys. When he arrived at their house, he asked them about the mysterious DVD, but they said they had nothing to do with it. They invited him inside to watch it and see what was on it. When they sat down on the sofa and pressed play on the DVD player, they were surprised at what they saw on the screen. There was a creepy clown standing in a room. There was a bed on his left and a closet on his right. He was holding 2 red balloons and staring into the camera. Then some weird music started playing and the clown began dancing and jumping around. He was jerking and shaking his body all around the room. All the while, his clown face was fixed in a wide, menacing grin. He looked insane, and his behavior was bizarre. Clink, clink. 2 of the boys thought it was hilarious and started laughing out loud. After a while, they noticed that the 3rd boy was very quiet. When they turned to look at him, they could see that his face was white as a sheet, and his eyes were wide in terror. "What's the matter with you?" they asked. "Why aren't you laughing?" The boy replied in a weak voice, "That's my bedroom." For a tired child, bedtime is always a happy and relaxing event when they relax and drift off into a restful slumber. Some children complain when their parents force them to go to sleep before their bedtime. For me, bedtime was always a fearful and terrifying event that I dreaded every night. My fear of sleeping began when I was 8 years old. My parents moved me into my own bedroom, a small and narrow room at the back of the house, just large enough for a bunk bed and a chest of drawers. It had only one window, which looked out onto the back garden and didn't let in much light. It was the first time I had ever slept on my own, and from the very first night, I remember experiencing a strange feeling of unease. As I lay on the top bunk, trying to fall asleep, I thought I heard a noise. I couldn't be sure, but it seemed to be coming from the bottom bunk. The room was pitch black, and the curtains on the window let in just enough light to make out vague shapes in the dark. At first, I wasn't sure what the noise was. Sometimes the simplest of sounds can be the most unnerving. I listened closely and realized that it was the unmistakable sound of bed sheets rustling in the dark. The bottom bunk was empty, but when I peered over the edge of my bed, I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye. Something suddenly withdrawing out of sight into the bottom bunk. Something that did not wish to be seen. I lay there in disbelief, trying to convince myself that it was just my fevered imagination running wild. I turned to face the wall and closed my eyes, willing myself to fall asleep quickly. The rustling noise beneath me steadily increased until I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever was lurking in the bottom bunk began to toss and turn violently. Fear gripped my heart, and I had a terrible sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. My pulse was racing, and I broke out into a cold sweat. I could hear the sheets thrashing back and forth below. Eventually, I couldn't take the tension anymore, and cried out for my mother. Suddenly, the bunk bed began to shake violently, clattering against the wall. The bed sheets below me were still twisting and turning. I couldn't get out of bed in case the thing in the bottom bunk reached out and grabbed me. I imagined it pulling me by the ankle and dragging me off into the darkness. I was trapped in the top bunk, like a cornered rat, unable to flee. I clutched my blanket with white knuckles and waited. The door finally burst open, and my mother came in to calm me down. Tears were streaming down my face. She lay down in the empty bunk and promised to stay there until morning. Eventually, I was able to fall asleep. The next day, as I played in the backyard, I kept glancing up at my bedroom window. Each time, a chill ran down my spine, and my hair stood on end. I felt like something was lurking in that room, watching me play and waiting for night to fall so it could be alone with me again. I tried to tell my parents about it, but they wouldn't listen to me. They just dismissed my claims as childish fears of the dark, and when night arrived, they ushered me upstairs and forced me to get into bed. "Go to sleep," said my mother. "Stop being such a baby." I didn't protest. It was no use. I resigned myself to my fate, climbed up to the top bunk, got under the covers, and waited. Lying there in the darkness, alone and frightened, I heard the quiet rustling of bed sheets and knew it was starting again. But this time, it was different. I heard the sound of slow, rasping breathing coming from the bottom bunk. The soft, labored wheezing made me shudder. Only a flimsy mattress separated me from whatever was lurking below. Lying there, paralyzed with fear, I just wanted the thing to leave me alone. Its labored breathing became louder and louder. Then, suddenly, I felt something long and thin poking at the underside of my mattress. I screamed in horror, and the bunk bed began shaking violently. My mother came rushing in and calmed me down with a comforting hug. Eventually, my terror subsided, and with her standing guard, I was able to fall into an uneasy sleep. This continued for weeks. Night after night, I would wake up to the sound of rustling sheets. Each time, I would scream for help, and the bed would begin to shake violently. As soon as my mother came in, everything would stop, and she would have to spend the rest of the night in the bottom bunk, just so I could go to sleep. It was a difficult time for my family. My grandmother was sick, and my mother had to go and take care of her. When I found out that my mother would be away for the whole weekend, I flew into a panic. There would be nobody to protect me from the thing in the bottom bunk. No one would answer my cries in the middle of the night. On the day my mother left, I rushed home after school and immediately stripped the bed sheets and mattress off the lower bunk and removed all of the slats. My plan was to prevent that thing having a place to sleep for the night. I hoped that somehow this would protect me. Unfortunately, that night proved to be the most terrifying experience of all. To this day, I shudder to think about it. I managed to fall asleep, but in the middle of the night something woke me up. The room was pitch black and there was no noise, no rustling of sheets, no movement at all. However, something didn't feel right. Just then, I felt the covers on my bed begin to move. The horrifying truth suddenly dawned on me. The wretched thing that had terrorized me night after night was not in the bottom bunk. It was in my bed. I opened my mouth and tried to scream, but nothing came out. My eyes were wide with terror, and I lay motionless, barely able to breathe. I didn't want to let it know I was awake. I could feel it lying beside me, something cold and slimy leaning against my right arm. It was lying under the blanket. I could see its outline, but I didn't dare to look. All of a sudden it rolled over on top of me, and I felt its weight pressing down on me. I will never forget that awful feeling. Hours passed, and I lay there motionless, in the darkness, too frightened to move a muscle. I wanted to cry, but no tears would come out. Finally, I reached my breaking point and couldn't bear it a moment longer. Ever so slowly, I tried to ease myself out from under it. Inch by painstaking inch, I shifted my weight, moving sideways. Just as I thought I was about to escape, it moved. Dear God, it moved. I felt a clammy hand reach across my chest and close around my throat. Its grip gradually tightened, and I felt it squeezing my neck. The horrid, slimy thing began writhing and contorting under the blanket. I could hear it wheezing, rasping, and coughing. I felt its breath against my face, foul and cold as ice. Dawn was breaking, and the first rays of sunshine were peeking through the curtains. I fought for dear life, but I was no match for it. As its scrawny fingers squeezed my neck, I felt the life ebbing from me. I tried to scream, but the thing's grip was too tight. I was fighting to stay conscious when, suddenly, it released me and slowly withdrew, melting slowly into the wall. I tumbled off the bed and scrambled out of the bedroom. When I got downstairs, I breathed a sigh of relief. I had survived the most horrible experience of my life. To this day, I still break out in a cold sweat at the sound of bed sheets rustling in the night. I spent the entire day trying to convince my father to spend the night in my room. It took some effort, but he finally agreed. Perhaps he was just trying to humor me while my mother was away. Whatever the reason, it proved to be a smart move because in one night it solved the problem for good. The very next morning, he stormed into my room and told me to pack a suitcase. We were moving to a hotel. A group of teenagers went on a trip to the seaside. They found a cliff that overlooked the water and sat down to have a picnic. Afterwards, some of the teenagers decided to go for a swim. They took turns diving from the cliff into the water. One girl had brought her camera with her, and she began taking pictures of her friends as they jumped. One of the boys jumped off the cliff and landed in the sea with an enormous splash. His friends clapped and cheered, but when they peered over the cliff, they couldn't see him. The boy never surfaced, and his tearful friends had to call the police. A team of rescue workers eventually dragged the boy's body out of the sea. He had drowned. A week later, after attending the funeral, the dead boy's friends were looking through the photos they had taken that day. When they came to one picture in particular, they stopped and stared in horror. It was a photo of the drowned boy, taken just as he was jumping off the cliff. Clearly visible in the photograph, coming out of the water, were countless pale white hands, clutching the boy tightly and dragging him into the sea. Eliska looked at the large, crumbling mansion that lay across the fields from her little house. It had been empty for as long as she could remember. Every day, she gazed at it from her bedroom window and imagined what it would be like to live there. Ella Skye and her brother Chris lived with their parents in a small, dilapidated house. Her family was poor, and they couldn't afford to make the necessary repairs. Eliska was always too embarrassed to invite any of her friends over after school. One night, Eliska had a very strange dream about the old mansion. She dreamed that a beautiful young girl lived in the mansion, and she invited Eliska to come inside. In the dream, the mansion was filled with ornate furnishings and the walls were lined with expensive paintings. She dreamed that the girl showed her a room that was filled with beautiful jewelry. She looked, and the next morning when she awoke, Eliska looked out the window and noticed something different about the mansion. It looked as if the walls had been freshly painted, and there were curtains in the windows. It seemed like someone had moved in after all. At breakfast that morning, she told Chris about her strange dream. "That's funny," Chris replied. "I had almost the exact same dream." "Oh, that's weird," Eliska said, puzzled. Chris nodded in agreement. That evening, when Eliska and Chris were playing in the field beside their house, they met a strange young girl. She was a very beautiful girl, with long black hair and dark eyes. She was wearing an exquisite dress that shimmered in the fading light. "Hello," she said. "Hi," Chris replied. "Who are you?" "My name is Angela," the girl said. "I'm your new neighbor. My parents and I just moved into the mansion over there." When she heard this, Eliska's mouth dropped open in astonishment. She was lost for words. "I'm Chris, and this is my sister Eliska," Chris said. "Pleased to meet you," Angela said as she shook their hands. "Since I'm new in town, I don't really know anyone. Would you two be my friends?" "Of course," Eliska said eagerly. "Sure," said Chris. "I'm so glad," Angela said. "Would you like to come and see our mansion?" "We would be delighted," Eliska said. Together, they walked through the tall grass until they came to the mansion. Angela opened the front door, and they followed her inside. The house was beautiful. It was filled with ornate furniture and expensive-looking paintings adorned the walls. When they went into the living room, they saw an elaborate chandelier hanging from the ceiling. "Hello, Mother, hello, Father," Angela said. Her parents were sitting on the sofa reading newspapers. They didn't look up as the youngsters filed past. "Come with me, Eliska," said Angela. "I want to show you my playroom. I think you'll like it." She opened a door and ushered Eliska inside. Eliska couldn't believe her eyes. It was exactly like the room she had seen in her dreams. The walls were lined with glass cases containing beautiful, intricate jewelry that sparkled in the light. Eliska couldn't take her eyes off it. She was mesmerized. "Try on anything you like," Angela said. "I'll let you keep whichever one you like the most." Eliska gasped as Angela left the room, shutting the door behind her. The girl moved from case to case, examining all the gorgeous necklaces, earrings, and brooches. She didn't know how much time had passed, but the spell was broken by a loud scream. It came from outside, and it sounded like her brother's voice. All of a sudden, she looked around and saw that the room was changing. There were cobwebs and dark stains on the ceiling. The faded wallpaper was peeling off the walls. The lush carpet was gone, and the floorboards were covered in damp and mold. The wooden door was rotten, and the hinges were rusty. Eliska grabbed the handle and pulled with all her might. She pulled so hard that the door came off its hinges and fell to the ground with a crash. When she went into the living room, she was shocked to see everything covered in dust. The plaster was falling off the walls. Sitting on the couch, where Angela's parents had been just moments before, were two mummified corpses. Their flesh was rotting off, exposing the bone underneath, and their faces were twisted in a silent. Rats scurried furtively back and forth across the bare floor, which was strewn with trash. In the middle of the room, where there had once been a coffee table, there was a large, dusty coffin, and its lid was hanging open. "Chris, where are you?" she cried as she frantically looked around the room. Just then, her brother came staggering down the stairs. He was clutching his neck and blood was pouring down the front of his shirt. He opened his mouth to speak, but all that came out was a gurgling sound. His throat had been slashed open, Angela appeared on the stairs behind him. She looked much taller, and her face was deathly pale. Her cheeks were sunk, and her skin was lined and wrinkled. Aliska's heart sank, and she felt as if she was going to faint. Angela's mouth opened wide, revealing sharp-pointed teeth tipped with blood. She lunged at Chris, biting into his throat and ripping out a chunk of flesh. Aliska let out a terrified shriek and ran to the front door. She was dizzy with fear, but she managed to pull it open, and when she got outside, she ran as fast as she could. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, and she couldn't stop screaming. She ran and ran across the field, wading through the tall grass, her heart beating fast and her hair standing on end. Eventually, she reached the safety of her own house. She rushed inside and slammed the door behind her. Then, in confusion, she looked around. She saw the dust, the cobwebs, the rats, the open coffin, and the dead body of her brother lying in a pool of blood on the floor. To her utter horror, she was back inside Angela's house, and there stood Angela, smiling from ear to ear with blood dripping down her chin. Before Aliska had a chance to react, Angela grabbed her by the shoulders and pulled her close. The last thing Algiska felt before everything went black was a pair of fangs sinking into her neck. A little girl opened the door to her parents' bedroom in the middle of the night. "Daddy, I had a bad dream," she said. Her father blinked his eyes and sat up in bed, leaning on his elbows. The digital alarm clock glowed red in the darkness. It was 3:33 a.m. "You want to climb into bed and tell me about it?" he asked. "No, Daddy," came the reply. The oddness of the situation made him wake up more fully. He could barely make out his daughter's pale form, outlined in the light from the doorway. "Not, sweetie?" he asked. The little girl began to cry. "Because in my dream, when I told you about the dream, the thing wearing Mommy's skin sat up," she whined. For a moment he felt paralyzed, unable to take his eyes off his daughter. Then he felt the covers behind him slowly beginning to shift. I went out for a cycle one gray Sunday afternoon on a lonely country road. I was miles from anywhere and got caught in a storm. The rain was pelting down, and there was no place to take shelter. Up ahead, not far from the road, I saw a large house that seemed to be deserted. It was an old chateau, and the walls were covered in poison ivy. Most of the windows had been boarded up, and it was obvious that it had been empty for a number of years. I decided to take shelter inside, and when I tried the front door, I was surprised to find it was unlocked. Indoors, there was a stale odor of damp and rotting wood. The house had an eerie feeling that made me a little uneasy. For some reason, the hair on the back of my neck was standing on end. Looking down, I happened to notice an odd trail in the dust that looked quite recent. It was as if something or someone had been dragged down the hallway. The strangest thing was that there were no footprints in the dust, just drag marks. There was an old coat hanging on the end of the staircase. Picking it up, I took a look at the worn and moth-eaten garment. In the back of the coat, there was a small hole, and the area around it was scorched and stained. It looked something like a bullet hole. It gave me the creeps. Did this mean that, at one time, the coat had been worn by a dead man? There was a stale odor of dampness and mold coming from the old coat. I got the feeling that it might be more than mold. There was a putrid smell of rot and decay. If I didn't know better, I would have said it was the stench of decomposing flesh. Standing there in the hallway, a sudden feeling of danger came over me, but with a slight shudder, I brushed it off. The whole atmosphere of the place seemed to be charged with evil. I went into the living room and tried to start a fire. While I was piling some damp wood into the fireplace, I tried to pull myself together and told myself that there was nothing to be frightened of. Even though the chateau was creepy and I wouldn't want to spend the night there, it was better than getting drenched in the driving rain. Just then I was startled by the sound of movement coming from the hallway. There was a single soft flop, as if something had dropped to the ground. I froze, and strained my ears to listen, but there was no further sound. Creeping quietly over to the door, I looked out. There was nothing in the hallway. All I could hear was the sound of the heavy rain outside. Then I noticed something strange. The old coat that had been hanging at the end of the stairs was gone. A chill crept down my spine, and I had the strangest feeling that I was no longer alone. Just then, I heard a low, evil chuckle echoing down the hallway, followed by the sound of stealthy movement. I turned, just in time to see a shapeless black mass rise up behind me. It was the empty sleeves jerked grotesquely at its sides as it slowly moved towards me. I couldn't take my eyes off it. As the thing advanced, I took a step backwards until I bumped against the fireplace. The empty sleeves reached out for my throat. I grabbed a poker from the fireplace and swung it with all my might, lashing out at the thing in front of me. As soon as I struck it, the coat collapsed to the ground in a heap. I fled from the room and ran out the front door as fast as I could. Looking back over my shoulder, I saw a black shape on the doorstep. I could have sworn it was the coat lying there, watching me escape. I didn't stop running until I came to a small country pub by the side of the road. I ordered a drink to steady my nerves and cautiously asked the landlord if he knew anything about the deserted house. After a while, he told me that it had once been occupied by a man who was a staff sergeant in the army. Those who knew him said he was the meanest man ever to walk the earth. They say he murdered his wife and tortured every living thing he could lay his hands on, including his own daughters. In the end, said the landlord, one of the daughters couldn't take the abuse any longer and wound up shooting him in the back with his own gun. I went out for a cycle one gray Sunday afternoon on a lonely country road. I was miles from anywhere and got caught in a storm. The rain was pelting down and there was no place to take shelter. Up ahead, not far from the road, I saw a large house that seemed to be deserted. It was an old chateau, and the walls were covered in poison ivy. Most of the windows had been boarded up, and it was obvious that it had been empty for a number of years. I decided to take shelter inside, and when I tried the front door, I was surprised to find it was unlocked. Indoors, there was a stale odor of damp and rotting wood. The house had an eerie feeling that made me a little uneasy. For some reason, the hair on the back of my neck was standing on end. Looking down, I happened to notice an odd trail in the dust that looked quite recent. It was as if something or someone had been dragged down the hallway. The strangest thing was that there were no footprints in the dust, just drag marks. There was an old coat hanging on the end of the staircase. Picking it up, I took a look at the worn and moth-eaten garment. In the back of the coat, there was a small hole, and the area around it was scorched and stained. It looked something like a bullet hole. It gave me the creeps. Did this mean that at one time the coat had been worn by a dead man? There was a stale odor of dampness and mold coming from the old coat. I got the feeling that it might be more than mold. There was a putrid smell of rot and decay. If I didn't know better, I would have said it was the stench of decomposing flesh. Standing there in the hallway, a sudden feeling of danger came over me, but with a slight shudder, I brushed it off. The whole atmosphere of the place seemed to be charged with evil. I went into the living room and tried to start a fire. While I was piling some damp wood into the fireplace, I tried to pull myself together and told myself that there was nothing to be frightened of. Even though the chateau was creepy and I wouldn't want to spend the night there, it was better than getting drenched in the driving rain. Just then, I was startled by the sound of movement coming from the hallway. There was a single soft flop, as if something had dropped to the ground. I froze and strained my ears to listen, but there was no further sound. Creeping quietly over to the door, I looked out. There was nothing in the hallway. All I could hear was the sound of the heavy rain outside. Then, I noticed something strange. The old coat that had been hanging at the end of the stairs was gone. A chill crept down my spine, and I had the strangest feeling that I was no longer alone. Just then, I heard a low, evil chuckle echoing down the hallway, followed by the sound of stealthy movement. I turned just in time to see a shapeless black mass rise up behind me. It was the empty sleeves jerked grotesquely at its sides as it slowly moved towards me. I couldn't take my eyes off it. As the thing advanced, I took a step backwards until I bumped against the fireplace. The empty sleeves reached out for my throat. I grabbed a poker from the fireplace and swung it with all my might, lashing out at the thing in front of me. As soon as I struck it, the coat collapsed to the ground in a heap. I fled from the room and ran out the front door as fast as I could. Looking back over my shoulder, I saw a black shape on the doorstep. I could have sworn it was the coat, lying there, watching me escape. I didn't stop running until I came to a small country pub by the side of the road. I ordered a drink to steady my nerves and cautiously asked the landlord if he knew anything about the deserted house. After a while, he told me that it had once been occupied by a man who was a staff sergeant in the army. Those who knew him said he was the meanest man ever to walk the earth. They say he murdered his wife and tortured every living thing he could lay his hands on, including his own daughters. In the end, said the landlord, one of the daughters couldn't take the abuse any longer and wound up shooting him in the back with his own gun. There was an old woman who ran a boarding house. She made a living by renting out the rooms to men who worked at a nearby chemical factory. Her house was run down and dilapidated, and the old woman was not very clean. She kept a hand towel in the kitchen to mop up spills. She also used it to clean the house. The hand towel was covered in dirt, grease, and grime. It was more like an old rag, and it smelled disgusting. One day, while she was dusting one of the rooms, the old lady accidentally dropped the filthy old hand towel. It fell down behind a radiator and got stuck. When she couldn't reach it, the old lady simply left it there and forgot about it. The man who rented the room was a lonely and cantankerous old fellow who had no family. The old house was cold and damp, so the man turned the radiator on full blast to keep warm. One morning, the old man didn't come down to breakfast. The old woman knocked on his door, but there was no answer. She used her keys to open the door, turned the knob, and went in. What she discovered horrified her. The old man was lying dead in his bed. His skin was cold and his face was blue. It looked like he had been smothered in his sleep. The police came, took a look at the dead body, asked a few questions, and left. The corpse was taken down to the morgue. The old man was a nobody, so no one cared that much whether he lived or died. The police decided that he had probably smothered accidentally in the blankets. They never even noticed the trail of slime that led across the pillow and onto his face. A few days later, the old woman put a notice in the newspaper advertising a room for rent. Not long after that, she had a new tenant. He was a young man who was very nervous and smoked cigarettes constantly. On the first night he spent in the room, the young man was laying in bed, smoking a cigarette. He thought he heard something shuffling about in the darkness, but he paid no attention. Things were always making noises in old houses. He reached over to stub his cigarette out in the ashtray, but his hand touched something damp and slimy. It felt like a wet cloth. Suddenly, the thing curled around his wrist. The young man gasped and pulled his hand back, dropping his cigarette. The thing around his wrist burst into flames. Before he could so much as scream, the thing flew off his hand and landed on his face, covering his nose and mouth. The old woman was awakened by the sound of sirens outside. There were fire engines pulling up outside her house, and she could smell smoke. When the fire was put out, most of the old house had been gutted. The young man's charred corpse was found, still lying in his bed. The fire department decided that the blaze was caused by the young man's stupid and dangerous habit of smoking in bed. The old woman had insurance, so she collected a large sum of money and bought a new house. She never wondered what happened to the filthy old hand towel she dropped down the back of the radiator.